The fog had thickened by the time the patrolman heard the whistle. It came from somewhere near the railway arch, sharp and insistent, cutting through the wet October air like a blade through silk. His boots echoed against the cobblestones as he ran, his breath forming clouds in the darkness. The gaslight on Burner Street flickered, casting shadows that moved like living things against the brick walls. When he rounded the corner into Dutfield's yard, he saw the crowd first. Dockers and night workers pressing forward, their faces pale in the lamplight. They parted as he approached, and there, in the narrow passage between the printing office and the wall, lay what remained of Elizabeth Stride. Her throat had been opened so deeply that the white of her spine showed through the dark wound. Blood pooled beneath her body, still warm, still spreading across the stones. Her hand was clutched tight around a packet of cashews, the little perfumed lozenges she had bought to sweeten her breath. The patrolman bent closer, his hand trembling as he reached for her wrist. No pulse. The skin was cooling. Somewhere in the yard, a horse stamped nervously in its traces, and the fog pressed closer, as though the city itself were trying to hide what had been done. Within the hour, another woman would be found, not a mile away, butchered beyond recognition. The autumn of 1888 had begun its descent into legend. Chapter 1: The Autumn of Blood. Good evening, and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night has drawn close around you now, wherever you find yourself in this quiet hour. Perhaps you are nestled beneath blankets as the world outside grows still, or perhaps you listen as the city hums distantly beyond your window. Take a moment, if you would, to tell us in the comments where you are listening from tonight, and what hour finds you seeking refuge in these old stories. We are grateful for your company here in the darkness, and if you find some comfort in these whispered histories, we invite you to subscribe to our channel. Each story we tell helps us continue this work, allows us to illuminate another forgotten corner of the past, and your support through a simple subscription means more than you might imagine. Tonight's tale is one that has echoed through the centuries, a story that transformed the streets of London into a hunting ground and gave birth to a name that would never be forgotten. So settle deeper into comfort, let the present world recede, and drift backward with us now to the autumn of 1888, when blood first began to stain the cobblestones of Whitechapel. The summer had been long and heavy that year, pressing down upon London like a fever that would not break. By late August, the heat had begun to crack and splinter, giving way to the first cold winds that came sweeping up the Thames from the sea. In the East End, where the river bent and widened, where the great docks stretched along the water, and the warehouses rose like fortresses against the sky, the change of season brought no relief. The streets remained as they had always been, narrow and twisting, choked with refuse, and running with water that no one would drink if they could help it. The buildings leaned against one another as though exhausted, their walls blackened by coal smoke and their windows reflecting nothing but shadows. This was Whitechapel, a name that would soon be spoken with dread across the empire and beyond. But in the autumn of 1888, it was merely one more district where the poor made their desperate homes. 30,000 souls lived pressed together in those few square miles. They worked in the match factories and the breweries, in the slaughterhouses and tanneries, in the sweatshops where immigrant tailors bent over their needles 16 hours each day. They hauled cargo at the docks when work could be found, and there they starved when it could not. The women walked the streets at night, selling what they could sell, because a bed in a common lodging house cost 4p, and a loaf of bread cost 2p more, and there were always children to feed or gin to buy, or simply the animal need to survive another day. The streets belonged to them after dark, these women with their worn boots and their tattered shawls, their faces painted with rouge bought cheap from the chemist, their voices calling out to the men who passed in search of a few minutes of oblivion. The police knew them all by name. Constables walking their beats in the small hours would nod to the familiar faces, move them along from doorways where they could not be allowed to sleep, sometimes offer a word of warning about which alleys to avoid. The women knew the rhythms of the night as well as they knew the hollows of their own hunger. They knew which public houses closed at midnight and which stayed open later. They knew the locations of the coffee stalls where a halfpenny would buy a cup of something hot. They knew the shortcuts through the courts and yards, the places where a man might take them for their transaction, the sounds that meant danger approaching. They had survived this long by knowing, by moving through the darkness with the instinct of creatures who had learned that hesitation meant death. But in the late summer of 1888, something new had entered their world. The first whispers came in early August, passed from woman to woman in the lodging houses and the public houses, traded like currency in the markets where they bought their bread. A woman named Emma Smith had been attacked back in April, set upon by a gang of men who had beaten her and violated her with such violence that she died days later in the hospital. Another woman, Martha Tabram, had been found dead on a landing in George Yard Buildings on the 7th of August, stabbed 39 times, her body left in a spreading pool of blood for the morning light to reveal. These deaths were not uncommon in themselves. Women died in Whitechapel with grim regularity, from drink or disease or violence or simple despair. But there was something in the manner of these killings that unsettled even those who had long grown accustomed to brutality. The newspapers had begun to take notice. The penny press that fed on sensation and scandal had found in these murders a story that could be stretched across columns, embellished with lurid detail, sold to a public that devoured such horrors with their morning tea. The journalists came to Whitechapel with their notebooks and their cameras, seeking interviews with anyone who might have seen or heard something useful. They wrote of the dangerous classes and the criminal poor, of the rookeries where vice and murder flourished in the absence of proper civilization. They wrote with the comfortable certainty of men who would return each evening to their own safe neighbourhoods, to their own clean beds, leaving behind the streets where women still had to walk and men still had to sleep rough, and children still cried from hunger in rooms that stank of rot and human waste. The authorities responded, as they always did, with promises of increased police presence and stern warnings about public morality. The district had long been a source of embarrassment to the city's governors, a festering wound on the body of the empire's greatest metropolis. Reformers had been calling for years for something to be done about the conditions in the East End, for the slums to be cleared and the poor to be moved to more wholesome accommodations, but nothing ever changed. There was no profit in housing the destitute, no political advantage in championing the cause of those who could not vote and would not be missed. So Whitechapel remained as it was, a place where people lived because they had nowhere else to go, and died because no one with power cared enough to prevent it. As August faded into September, the heat finally broke entirely. Rain began to fall, cold and persistent, turning the unpaved courts into seas of mud and the gutters into rivers of filth. The fog rolled in from the Thames, thick and yellow with the smoke of 10,000 coal fires, or reducing visibility to a few feet and muffling all sound. It was the kind of weather that drove people indoors when they could afford to be indoors, that made the night seem even darker and more threatening than usual. The women who worked the streets wrapped their shawls tighter and continued their walks, because the rent was still due and the body still needed feeding, and there was no other choice available to them. They moved through the fog like ghosts, these women. Their names were Mary Ann and Annie and Elizabeth and Catherine and Mary Jane. They were in their 40s and 30s and 20s, worn beyond their years by poverty and drink and the grinding brutality of survival. They had been married and widowed or had never married at all. They had borne children who had died or been taken from them. They had worked in factories and as domestic servants until age, or illness, or simple bad luck had left them with no option but the streets. They were not criminals, though the law treated them as such. They were not monsters, though society regarded them with a mixture of pity and contempt. They were human beings trying to live in a world that had decided they did not matter. In the first days of September, as the fog pressed close and the rain continued to fall, the women of Whitechapel could not have known what was coming. They could not have known that one among the men who walked those same streets, who perhaps brushed past them in the darkness or watched them from the shadows, had already begun to plan their destruction. They could not have known that their names would be remembered long after the names of queens and prime ministers had faded from memory, that their deaths would become legend, that the manner of their dying would be studied and debated and reimagined, for more than a century to come. They knew only that they were cold and hungry and tired, and that the night required them to keep walking, to keep calling out to strangers, to keep hoping that the next man who approached would have coin in his pocket and not murder in his heart. The autumn had arrived, and with it came a darkness that was more than simply the absence of light. Something was moving through Whitechapel, something that would soon reveal itself in blood and horror. The women walked on because they had to walk on because there was nothing else for them to do. And somewhere in that maze of courts and alleys, in that fog-shrouded labyrinth where poverty and desperation had created a world unto itself, the man who had become known as Jack the Ripper was preparing to begin his work. The first of them would die within days. The others would follow one by one until the autumn of blood had run its course and the name of Whitechapel had become synonymous with terror itself. The city slept uneasily that September, and the fog continued to rise from the river, and the women continued to walk, and history held its breath before the scream. Chapter 2. The Abyss. The lodging houses of Whitechapel stood as monuments to human degradation, great warrens of brick and timber where the poorest of the poor paid their pennies for a night's refuge from the streets. They lined the thoroughfares and filled the courts, identifiable by the perpetual stream of humanity flowing in and out of their doors, by the smell that emanated from them even in the coldest weather, by the sounds that rose from their windows at all hours. These were not the workhouses, those grim institutions where the destitute could find shelter in exchange for labour and the surrender of all dignity. These were commercial enterprises, businesses that existed to extract what little coin remained in the pockets of those who had nothing. A bed for the night cost 4p, a space on the floor cost 2p, a place leaning against a rope stretched across a room where a person might doze standing upright until dawn cost a penny. Those who could not pay even that much slept in doorways or under arches or in the dank spaces beneath railway bridges and hoped they would wake when morning came. The common lodging house on Flower and Dean Street could accommodate some 300 souls on any given night. It rose 4 stories high, its facade blackened by decades of coal smoke, its windows crowded with faces that stared out at the street below with the blank expressions of those who had long since ceased to expect anything good from the world. The front door opened directly onto a passage that led to the kitchen, a vast room where fires burned in multiple grates and the air hung thick with steam and smoke, and the smell of unwashed bodies pressed too close together. Here the lodgers gathered when they returned from whatever employment or criminal enterprise or simple begging had occupied their day. They cooked what food they had managed to acquire, usually potatoes or bread or scraps of meat so cheap and suspect that no reputable household would have fed them to a dog. They warmed themselves by the fires. They talked and argued and sometimes fought, and when fights broke out, the deputy who ran the house would wade in with his stick to restore order. The deputy kept a book where each lodger's name was recorded along with their payment status. Those who could show 4p were allowed up the stairs to the sleeping rooms, where rows of narrow beds stood so close together that there was barely space to walk between them. The mattresses were thin and stained and alive with vermin. The blankets were rough and inadequate against the cold. There was no privacy, no possibility of solitude, no escape from the coughing and snoring and crying out of nightmares that filled the darkness. Women and men slept in separate rooms, though the separation meant little, and the sounds that came through the thin walls told their own stories of commerce and desperation. Those who paid only 2p were directed to the dormitories on the upper floors, great open spaces where people slept on the bare boards or on piles of rags they had brought with themselves, packed together like cargo in a ship's hold. The women who would die that autumn knew these places intimately. Mary Ann Nichols had stayed at a lodging house on Thrall Street until the night she was murdered, turned away because she lacked the 4p for a bed and had gone into the streets to earn it. Annie Chapman had made her home at Crossingham's lodging house on Dorset Street, where she shared a bed with another woman to split the cost. Elizabeth Stride moved between several such establishments, never staying long in any one place, her possessions few enough to carry in a small bundle. Catherine Eddowes had been released from the Bishopsgate police station. In the early hours of the morning she died, having been locked up overnight for drunkenness, and had set off into the darkness to earn the money she would need for a bed. Mary Jane Kelly had achieved something slightly better. A small room of her own in Miller's Court, barely 8 feet square but hers alone, though she was weeks behind on the rent and her landlord was beginning to press for payment. They woke each morning in these places to the sound of the deputy banging on doors and shouting that it was time to leave. The lodging houses emptied at dawn, their residents spilling out into the streets to face another day of searching for work or coin or simply survival. Some went to the docks, hoping to be chosen for a day's labour. Some went to the markets to sell flowers or matches or their own bodies. Some went nowhere at all, but simply walked the streets because movement was better than stillness. Because the walking at least gave the illusion of purpose. They returned as evening fell, those who had earned enough and paid their pennies and climbed the stairs to whatever rest they could find. Those who had not earned enough did not return at all, but remained outside in the darkness and prayed they would live to see another sunrise. The streets themselves formed a maze that could confuse even those who had lived in Whitechapel all their lives. The main thoroughfares were broad enough for carts and carriages, lined with shops and public houses that did steady business serving the labouring poor. But behind these streets lay a warren of courts and alleys and passages, so narrow that two people could barely pass each other, leading nowhere but to dead ends choked with refuse. The buildings leaned inward, blocking out what little sunlight might have reached the ground, creating perpetual twilight even at noon. Washing lines stretched between the upper windows, hung with clothes that never quite dried in the damp air. Children played in the gutters, their games violent and joyless, their faces old before their time. Dogs roamed in packs, feeding on whatever could be scavenged from the heaps of garbage that accumulated in corners and courtyards. Bucks Row was one such street, a shabby thoroughfare that ran between Whitechapel Road and the London Hospital. Board schools and warehouses lined its length, their walls forming canyons of shadow. Hanbury Street cut through the heart of Spitalfields, its buildings housing workshops and small factories on their ground floors and cramped lodgings above. Berner Street led to Dutfield's Yard, where the International Working Men's Educational Club held its meetings in rooms that smelled of tobacco smoke and revolutionary fervour. Mitre Square opened off Duke Street, a small cobbled space surrounded by warehouses. Quiet after dark, the perfect place for murder. Miller's Court was not a court at all, but a narrow passage, 12 feet wide, leading to a handful of rooms where people lived in conditions that defied description. The inhabitants of these streets had developed their own society, their own hierarchies and codes of conduct. The costermongers who sold fruit and vegetables from their barrows looked down upon the pure-finders who collected dog droppings to sell to the tanneries. The pure-finders considered themselves superior to the mudlarks who scavenged in the Thames at low tide for anything that might be sold. The mudlarks at least had work, unlike the beggars who stood on corners displaying their deformities or their children's hunger. The thieves and pickpockets operated with professional pride, disdaining the clumsy violence of the roughs who robbed with fists and clubs. The prostitutes maintained their own pecking order, with those who could afford a room looking down upon those who worked against walls in dark alleys. But poverty united them all in the end, made them neighbours in misery, gave them a shared understanding of what it meant to live always on the edge of catastrophe. A lost job, an illness, a theft, a simple stroke of bad luck could send anyone tumbling down into the next lower circle of degradation. The match girls whose faces were rotting from phosphorus poisoning knew they might soon be reduced to begging. The dockers who found work one day knew they might find none the next. The women who sold flowers knew that age and illness would eventually force them to sell something else. There was no safety net, no system of relief that did not come with humiliation and the workhouse attached to it. There was only the daily struggle to earn enough to survive one more day, and the knowledge that failure meant death, slow or fast but certain. The police who patrolled these streets walked in pairs after dark, their bullseye lanterns cutting pale circles in the fog, their wooden rattles ready to hand in case they needed to summon help. They were not loved by the residents of Whitechapel, who saw them as agents of a society that had abandoned the poor while still demanding they obey its laws. But they were sometimes respected, and often feared, and the mere presence of a constable's uniform could scatter a crowd or prevent a fight from turning deadly. The Metropolitan Police maintained several stations in the district and were each responsible for a specific territory, each manned by sergeants and constables who knew the streets as well as any criminal. They broke up brawls outside public houses. They arrested prostitutes for soliciting and drunks for being incapable. They investigated thefts and assaults and the occasional murder, filing reports that would be read by superiors who had never set foot in the East End and never would. Inspector Edmund Reed commanded H Division, which covered Whitechapel and the surrounding areas. He was a capable officer who had risen through the ranks, a man who understood that maintaining order in such a district required both firmness and a certain degree of tolerance for behaviours that would not be permitted in wealthier neighbourhoods. Inspector Frederick Abberline worked out of Scotland Yard but knew Whitechapel intimately from years spent walking its streets. Detective Sergeant William Thick had earned the nickname Johnny Upright for his rigid adherence to procedure and his imposing physical presence. These men and dozens of others like them formed the thin line between the chaos of the slums and complete lawlessness, and they knew that line was thinner than most of London's citizens would have cared to admit. As September deepened, as the nights grew longer and colder, the residents of Whitechapel went about their business with the resignation of those who had long since accepted that life was hard and death was cheap. The lodging houses filled each evening. The public houses emptied their barrels of gin and beer. The streets echoed with the cries of sellers and the curses of drunks and the weeping of children who were hungry and cold. The fog came and went, the rain fell and stopped and fell again, and the great machine of poverty ground on, crushing those caught in its gears, indifferent to individual suffering. And somewhere in that mass of struggling humanity, someone was watching, someone was waiting, someone was preparing to transform a forgotten corner of the empire's capital into a charnel house that would haunt the world's imagination forever. The abyss looked up at London's gleaming heart, and London did not look back. Not yet. Not until the blood began to flow. Chapter 3. The first to fall. Mary Ann Nichols was 43 years old on the last day of her life. She had been born Mary Ann Walker in the summer of 1845, in a London that was smaller and less choked with humanity than the metropolis it had become by the time of her death. Her father had been a locksmith, a skilled tradesman who had provided his family with a respectable working-class existence. She had grown up knowing how to read and write, had attended school, had possessed all the advantages that separated the respectable poor from those who lived in complete degradation. At the age of 18, she had married William Nichols, a printer, and together they had produced 5 children who survived infancy. For nearly 2 decades they had maintained a household, had lived as husband and wife should live, had participated in the rhythms of ordinary working life. But something had broken between them. Perhaps it was the drink, for Mary Ann had developed a taste for gin that grew stronger with each passing year. Perhaps it was another woman, for William claimed to have discovered his wife's infidelity and used it as grounds for their separation. Perhaps it was simply the grinding poverty that wore away at affection, until nothing remained but resentment and recrimination. Whatever the cause, the marriage had collapsed in 1881, and Mary Ann had begun the long slide downward that would end on a street in Whitechapel 7 years later. She lived for a time in workhouses, moved between lodging houses, tried and failed to maintain employment as a domestic servant. She had last worked for a family in Wandsworth, but had left their service in July, stealing clothing worth £3.10 when she departed. Since then she had been living rough, sleeping where she could, drinking when she could afford it, walking the streets when necessity demanded. On the 31st of August 1888, she had spent the evening drinking in a public house on Whitechapel Road. She had worn her best clothes, though best was a relative term, a reddish-brown dress of rough fabric, a black straw bonnet trimmed with black velvet, a brown jacket. She had pawned the jacket and the bonnet earlier in the day for 1 shilling and 8 pence, but had retrieved them before the public houses closed. By midnight she was very drunk, staggering along the pavement, her speech slurred, her judgment impaired. A friend encountered her at the corner of Osborne Street and Whitechapel Road and tried to persuade her to come back to the lodging house, but Mary Ann refused. She needed 4pence for her bed, she explained, and she would earn it even if she had to walk all night. Her friend watched her disappear into the darkness, moving eastward along Whitechapel Road, and never saw her alive again. The man who found her body was a carter named Charles Cross, walking to work in the early hours of the morning. The time was approximately 3:45, and the sky had not yet begun to lighten. Bucks Row was dark and silent, the warehouses that lined it showing no signs of life. Cross was approaching the entrance to Brown's stable yard when he noticed something lying in the gateway. His first thought was that it was a tarpaulin, perhaps fallen from a cart or left behind by workmen. But as he drew closer, he saw that it was a woman, lying on her back with her skirts raised to her waist. He approached cautiously, unwilling to touch what he assumed was a drunk woman sleeping in the street, and called out to another carter who was approaching from the opposite direction. Together they bent over the woman, and in the dim light from a distant street lamp they saw that her face was still warm to the touch, though her hands were cold. They could not tell in the darkness whether she was breathing. The two men left the body where it lay and went in search of a policeman. They found Police Constable John Neal making his rounds on Bucks Row and led him back to the gateway. Neal lit his bullseye lantern and directed its beam onto the woman's face, and saw immediately that she was dead. Her eyes were open and staring. Her mouth was slightly parted. There was blood on the ground beneath her head, though not as much as there should have been given what had been done to her. Neal sent one of the carters to fetch Dr. Rhys Llewellyn, who lived on Whitechapel Road, while he knelt beside the body to examine it more closely. He pulled down her skirts to give her some measure of dignity, and as he did so he noticed something strange about the way her dress lay across her abdomen. The fabric was soaked with blood, though there was no blood on the ground around her body. Dr. Llewellyn arrived within minutes, still dressed in his nightshirt and coat, carrying his medical bag. He made a cursory examination by lantern light and pronounced the woman dead, estimating she had been deceased no more than 30 minutes. The cause of death was immediately apparent. Her throat had been cut twice, both wounds running from left to right, the deeper of the two cutting through to the spinal column. The windpipe and gullet had been completely severed, but it was when Llewellyn opened her dress that the true horror became apparent. Her abdomen had been opened by a deep jagged wound. There were several other incisions across the lower part of the abdomen, along with 3 or 4 similar cuts on the right side. The wounds were still bleeding sluggishly, which suggested they had been inflicted very shortly before the body was discovered. An ambulance was summoned, and the body was removed to the mortuary shed at Old Montague Street Workhouse, a shabby building that served as the repository for pauper corpses. There, in better light, Dr. Llewellyn conducted a more thorough examination. The throat wounds were the primary cause of death, inflicted with such force that they had nearly decapitated the victim. But the abdominal mutilations had been performed after death, with the killer taking time to arrange the body and position the clothing. The intestines had been exposed but not removed. The cuts showed no medical skill, but were not entirely random either. Someone had opened this woman's body with deliberate intent. Someone who had remained with the corpse long enough to complete their work even though discovery was always imminent. Someone who had then left without leaving any clear trail of blood or other evidence. The dead woman's identity remained unknown for some hours. She carried no money, no papers, nothing that might identify her. Her clothing bore laundry marks, but these had to be traced through the various workhouses and lodging houses where such marking was done. It was not until the afternoon of the 1st of September that her identity was established. She was Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly to her friends, a resident of 18 Thrall Street lodging house. The deputy of that establishment identified her by the clothing and by a scar on her forehead that had been left by a fall years earlier. Her estranged husband was contacted and confirmed the identification, though he refused to pay for her burial. Her father, aged 71, came to view the body and wept over what had become of his daughter. The inquest was held at the Working Lads Institute on Whitechapel Road, with Wynne Baxter serving as coroner. Witnesses testified to seeing Mary Ann in the hours before her death. The friend who had encountered her on Whitechapel Road described her drunken condition and her determination to earn the fourpence she needed for a bed. A lodging house keeper testified that Mary Ann had been wearing a new bonnet earlier in the evening, black straw with black velvet trim, and had been proud of it. The carters who found the body described the position in which she lay and their inability to determine initially whether she was alive or dead. Police Constable Neal testified to arriving on the scene and finding no blood trail, no signs of struggle, nothing to suggest where the killer might have gone. Dr. Llewellyn provided medical testimony that was both clinical and disturbing. The throat wounds had been inflicted with a long-bladed knife, possibly 6 to 8 inches in length, wielded with considerable force. The abdominal mutilations had been performed after death, with the killer kneeling or squatting beside the body. The cuts showed no particular anatomical knowledge, but demonstrated a certain deliberation in their execution. Death would have been nearly instantaneous from the throat wounds. The victim would have had no time to cry out. The amount of blood on the scene was less than expected because most of it had been absorbed by her clothing, and because the killer had apparently positioned himself to avoid being splashed. The jury returned a verdict of willful murder by person or persons unknown, the standard conclusion in cases where no suspect could be identified. The newspapers reported the crime with moderate interest, noting that this was the third murder of a woman in Whitechapel within 5 months. The Times devoted a few paragraphs to the case, focusing on the brutality of the killing and the danger posed to women who walk the streets at night. The local papers were more sensational in their coverage, describing the scene in lurid detail and speculating about the kind of man who could commit such an act. But London was a violent city, and murders were not uncommon, particularly in the slums of the East End. Mary Ann Nichols was buried in a pauper's grave in the City of London cemetery, and within days the public had largely forgotten her name. The police had not forgotten. Inspector John Spratling had been among the first senior officers to arrive at the scene, and he had noted details that troubled him deeply. The deliberate nature of the mutilations, the absence of any apparent motive, the skill with which the killer had worked in near total darkness without leaving evidence. The fact that the murder had occurred on a moderately well-travelled street with residents sleeping in the buildings on either side, yet no one had heard or seen anything suspicious. Inspector Frederick Abberline, who had extensive experience in Whitechapel, was called in to review the case. He read the reports and examined the evidence and felt the first stirrings of dread. This was not a common street murder. This was not the work of a drunk client who had killed a prostitute in a rage. This was something else entirely. On the 7th of September, a week after Mary Ann Nichols died, a letter arrived at the Central News Agency. It was written in red ink and signed with a name that would echo through history, but that letter came too late to save Annie Chapman, who was already lying dead in a backyard in Spitalfields, her body opened from throat to pelvis, her intestines arranged over her shoulder, her uterus missing. The autumn of blood had truly begun, and Mary Ann Nichols, who had lived 43 hard years and died wanting nothing more than fourpence for a bed, became the first official victim of the man the world would call Jack the Ripper. Her blood had christened the cobblestones of Bucks Row, and before the month was over, those stones would drink deeply again. Chapter 4. The second death. Annie Chapman had been born Eliza Ann Smith in September of 1841, making her 47 years old in the summer of her death. She had come from a slightly higher station than Mary Ann Nichols, her father having been a soldier in the Life Guards, one of the elite cavalry regiments that protected the sovereign. She had married John Chapman, a coachman, in 1869, and together they had produced 3 children, though only 2 survived to adulthood. For nearly 2 decades she had maintained a respectable household in Windsor, living as a coachman's wife should live, attending to domestic duties, raising her children, participating in the modest social life available to women of her class. But here too, as with Mary Ann Nichols, something had broken. The marriage had failed. John Chapman had obtained a legal separation in 1882, citing his wife's drinking and immoral conduct as grounds. He had agreed to pay her 10 shillings a week in support, an arrangement that continued until his death in 1886. With the loss of that income, Annie Chapman had descended rapidly into the depths of poverty. She had lived for a time in Windsor, attempting to support herself by selling flowers and doing crochet work, but the work was irregular and poorly paid. She had drifted to London, to the lodging houses of Spitalfields and Whitechapel, where the rent was cheap and no questions were asked about one's circumstances. She had continued to sell flowers when she could, and crochet work and antimacassars that she made with her own hands. But increasingly she had been forced to sell the only commodity that remained to her, the use of her body, walking the streets at night in search of men who would pay a few pennies for a few minutes of joyless coupling in a dark alley. By the autumn of 1888, she had been living for several months at Crossingham's lodging house at 35 Dorset Street, one of the most notorious streets in the most notorious district of London. The lodging house was a massive establishment, housing hundreds of people, its passages and staircases a maze where the police seldom ventured without reinforcement. Annie shared a double bed with another woman to split the cost, paying 4p a night for half a bed, or 2p for permission to sit in the kitchen when she could not afford even that. She was known to the deputy, Timothy Donovan, as a regular resident, usually able to pay her rent, sometimes drunk but rarely causing trouble. She was known to the other lodgers as Dark Annie, a nickname earned by her dark hair and her dark moods, by the melancholy that seemed to hang around her like a fog. She had not been well in the days before her death. Several residents of the lodging house would later testify that she had complained of feeling unwell, that she had appeared weak and ill. Her face was puffy and bruised, evidence of a fight she had been involved in earlier in the week with another lodging house resident. She had been living rough for several days, unable to afford even the 2p for a place in the kitchen, sleeping wherever she could find shelter. On the afternoon of Friday, the 7th of September, she had finally obtained some money and paid for her bed. But by 1:30 on the morning of Saturday the 8th, she was again being turned out because she lacked the 4p needed for another night. She was quite drunk, barely able to stand, but she refused the deputy's suggestion that she go to the casual ward of the workhouse. She would return shortly with the money, she insisted. She had been to her regular public house and back and would return again. She was last seen alive at approximately 5:30 that morning by Elizabeth Long, a resident of Church Street. Long was walking along Hanbury Street towards Spitalfields Market when she noticed a man and woman talking outside number 29. The woman stood with her back against the shutters of the house. The man faced her, his back to Long as she passed. Long heard the woman say yes in response to something the man had said, but paid little attention beyond that. Such encounters were common in Spitalfields in the early morning hours, women negotiating with clients before leading them to some private place. Long continued on her way to the market and thought nothing more of the couple till she learned what had happened. Number 29 Hanbury Street was a lodging house whose ground floor was occupied by various tenants. The front door was never locked, allowing residents to come and go at all hours. A passage ran from the front door through to a backyard, where a privy stood against the fence and a few packing cases were stacked against the wall. The yard was enclosed on 3 sides by the backs of buildings, their windows mostly dark at that hour, their residents either sleeping or not yet stirring for the day. It was a shabby, dirty space, littered with refuse, smelling of human waste and rotting garbage. It was also, in the pre-dawn darkness of the 8th of September, entirely private. At approximately 6 o'clock, John Davis, an elderly resident who occupied rooms on the 3rd floor of number 29, descended the stairs on his way to the privy in the backyard. He walked through the passage and pushed open the door that led to the yard and saw immediately that something was lying at the foot of the steps that led down from the door. His first thought was that one of the other residents had left something there, perhaps a piece of furniture they were discarding. Then he saw that it was a woman, and that she was lying in a position no living woman would adopt. He did not go closer. He turned and ran back through the passage and out into the street, where he encountered several workmen on their way to the docks. He told them what he had seen, and together they returned to number 29. The workmen looked into the yard and saw what Davis had seen. A woman lying on her back near the fence, her head toward the house, her feet toward the fence. Her skirts were pulled up to her waist. Her face was turned to the right, toward the building. Even from the doorway they could see that her throat had been cut, that blood covered the ground around her head and shoulders. One of the workmen, a packing case maker named James Kent, went into the yard for a closer look, and then wished he had not. Her abdomen had been opened entirely. Her intestines had been pulled out and draped over her right shoulder. Other organs had been arranged on the ground beside her body. The woman had not merely been killed, she had been dissected, opened like a specimen in an anatomy theatre, her internal organs exposed to the morning air. The police were summoned. Inspector Joseph Chandler arrived within minutes and immediately sent for the divisional surgeon. Dr. George Bagster Phillips, who lived nearby on Spiddle Square, arrived shortly after 6:30 and conducted his examination in the cold light of dawn. The victim had been dead for at least 2 hours, possibly longer. Rigor mortis had begun to set in. The body was cold to the touch. The throat had been cut in the same manner as Mary Ann Nichols, 2 deep incisions running from left to right, severing all the major vessels and cutting through to the spinal column, but the abdominal mutilations far exceeded anything that had been done to Nichols. The entire abdomen had been opened by a long, deep cut, clearly made with a sharp knife. The intestines had been lifted out and placed deliberately over the shoulder. Other organs had been removed and arranged around the body. Dr. Phillips requested that the body be removed to the mortuary before he conducted a full examination, and the ambulance was summoned to transport the corpse to the Whitechapel mortuary shed. There, in the cold light of the mortuary, Phillips discovered the full extent of what had been done. The uterus had been entirely removed, along with part of the bladder and part of the vagina. The removal had been done with some skill, requiring knowledge of anatomy and the use of a sharp knife at least 5 inches long. The killer had worked quickly but methodically, completing the mutilations in what Phillips estimated could have been no more than 15 minutes. Given the location of the murder, in a yard where residents might have looked out at any moment, where people passed constantly through the passage, the speed and precision of the work suggested someone who was either supremely confident or completely divorced from normal fear. The victim was identified within hours as Annie Chapman, resident of Crossingham's lodging house. The Deputy Donovan confirmed the identification, as did a woman named Amelia Palmer, who had been a friend of Chapman's and had seen her on the afternoon before her death. The identification was made easier by the presence of items found near the body, items that appeared to have been deliberately arranged by the killer. A piece of coarse muslin, a small tooth comb, part of an envelope that bore the seal of the Sussex Regiment and a letter M in blue. These items had been placed at the victim's feet, as though the killer wanted to leave a signature, a message, some indication that this was not random violence, but deliberate theatre. The inquest opened on Monday the 10th of September, again at the Working Lads Institute, again with Wynne Baxter presiding as coroner. The proceedings would continue for several weeks, with multiple sessions held as witness after witness testified to what they had seen and heard. Elizabeth Long described the man she had seen talking to Annie Chapman, though her description was vague. He was a little taller than Chapman, over 40 years of age, wearing a dark coat and a brown deerstalker hat. He had looked like a foreigner, though she could not say exactly what nationality. He had spoken in a voice that sounded shabby genteel, educated but fallen on hard times. Several other witnesses claimed to have heard sounds from the yard around the time of the murder, a woman's voice crying out "no," but the testimony was confused and contradictory, and it was impossible to determine what, if anything, they had actually heard. Dr. Phillips gave his medical testimony in careful detail, though he asked that the most graphic aspects be recorded in private to spare public sensibilities. The mutilations had been performed with considerable anatomical knowledge, he testified. The organs had been removed cleanly, without damage to surrounding tissue, in a manner that suggested someone who had dissected bodies before. The weapon had been a sharp knife with a blade at least 5 inches long, possibly a post-mortem knife of the type used by surgeons and anatomists. The killer had worked in near darkness, yet had performed his surgery with precision and speed. Phillips concluded that the murderer possessed both anatomical skill and a complete absence of normal human feeling, a combination that suggested either a medical man who'd gone mad or something even more disturbing. The newspapers exploded with coverage. Annie Chapman's murder could not be dismissed as an isolated incident or a random street crime. Coming so soon after Mary Ann Nichols, following the same pattern of throat cutting and abdominal mutilation, it was clear that a serial killer was operating in Whitechapel. The Times devoted entire columns to the case, interviewing residents of the East End and publishing letters from readers who offered theories about the killer's identity. The penny press went further, printing illustrations of the crime scene, speculating wildly about the murderer's motives and methods, creating an atmosphere of hysteria that spread through London like wildfire. The public demanded action. Questions were asked in Parliament. The Home Secretary was forced to defend the Metropolitan Police's handling of the investigation. In Whitechapel itself, terror had settled over the streets like the autumn fog. Women who had always walked those streets at night now went in groups or did not go at all. The lodging houses filled earlier each evening as residents sought safety in numbers. Vigilance committees were formed. Groups of local men who patrolled the streets carrying clubs and lanterns, searching for anyone who looked suspicious. The police presence was increased, with constables assigned to walk fixed beats through the most dangerous areas. But the streets of Whitechapel formed a maze that 1,000 policemen could not adequately patrol, and everyone knew that if the killer wanted to strike again, no amount of vigilance could prevent it. Annie Chapman was buried on Friday the 14th of September at Manor Park Cemetery. A large crowd gathered for the funeral, drawn by morbid curiosity and genuine sympathy in equal measure. The coffin was simple pine, paid for by charity, adorned with a single wreath. The service was brief, the grave was deep, and as the first shovelfuls of earth fell upon the coffin, the residents of Whitechapel were already whispering about what might come next. 2 women had died in the same manner within 9 days. The pattern was established. The killer had found his method and his hunting ground, and somewhere in those fog-bound streets, among the thousands of poor and desperate souls who called Whitechapel home, the man with the knife was waiting for his next opportunity to add to the harvest of blood. The autumn was deepening, and the darkness was growing longer, and the night had many more hours yet to fill. Chapter 5. The letter in red ink. The letter arrived at the Central News Agency on the morning of Thursday the 27th of September, delivered through the ordinary post, bearing a penny stamp and a postmark from the East Central District. The agency occupied offices on Newbridge Street in the City of London, and served as a clearinghouse for news that was then distributed to newspapers throughout the capital and beyond. The staff opened hundreds of letters each day, most of them containing tips about potential stories, complaints about perceived injustices, or simply the rambling thoughts of people who believed the press should hear their opinions. The letter that arrived that Thursday morning was written in red ink on lined paper torn from a notebook, and it began with a salutation that would become infamous. "Dear boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about leather apron can hear me real fits. I am down on whores and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled. Grand work the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. How can they catch me now? I love my work and want to start again. You will soon hear of me with my funny little games. I saved some of the proper red stuff in a ginger beer bottle over the last job to write with, but it went thick like glue and I can't use it. Red ink is fit enough, I hope, haha. The next job I do, I shall clip the lady's ears off and send to the police officers just for jolly, wouldn't you? Keep this letter back till I do a bit more work, then give it out straight. My knife's so nice and sharp, I want to get to work right away if I get a chance. Good luck. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Don't mind me giving the trade name." The letter continued with a postscript written at an angle across the bottom of the page. "Wasn't good enough to post this before I got all the red ink off my hands. Curse it. No luck yet. They say I'm a doctor now, ha ha." The handwriting was distinctive, flowing yet somewhat crude, the work of someone educated enough to write coherently but not schooled in the fine points of penmanship. The tone was mocking and gleeful, a man proud of his work and contemptuous of those who sought to stop him. The content contained details that had not been made public, particularly the reference to removing ears, which seemed to suggest inside knowledge of the crimes. But it was the signature that caught the attention of the agency's employees, Jack the Ripper, a name that sounded like something from a penny dreadful, theatrical and sinister, designed to create maximum impact. The editor at the Central News Agency considered the letter carefully. Such communications were not uncommon. Whenever a sensational crime occurred, the press received numerous letters from people claiming to be the perpetrator, seeking attention or simply enjoying the notoriety by association. Most were obvious hoaxes, written by attention seekers or lunatics who had no actual connection to the crimes. But this letter contained elements that suggested it might be genuine. The detailed knowledge of the murders, the promise of further killings, the specific threat to mutilate his next victim in a particular way. And there was something in the tone, a quality of genuine pleasure in the killing that distinguished it from the usual crank mail. The editor decided to forward the letter to the Metropolitan Police at Scotland Yard, where it arrived on Friday the 28th of September. The police examined the letter with deep skepticism. Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, who had been assigned overall command of the investigation, believed it to be a hoax. The handwriting did not match any samples they had on file. The claims about inside knowledge could easily have been gleaned from newspaper reports, which had been extensive and detailed. The theatrical nature of the letter, with its mockery and its invented nickname, seemed designed to create sensation rather than communicate genuine information. Swanson filed the letter away with the hundreds of other communications the police had received since the murders began, and returned his attention to more promising leads. The investigation was focusing on a man nicknamed Leather Apron, a bootmaker named John Pizer, who had been accused of threatening prostitutes in the area. Pizer would soon be cleared of any involvement, but for the moment he represented the kind of tangible suspect the police desperately needed. The letter would have remained buried in the files if not for what happened on the night of Saturday, the 29th of September. The killer struck again, not once but twice within the space of an hour, and the second murder contained a detail that seemed to fulfill the letter's prophecy. The double event, as it would come to be called, transformed the investigation and the public's perception of what was happening in Whitechapel. It also forced the police to reconsider the letter that had arrived at the Central News Agency, and to wonder if perhaps the writer had been genuine after all. Elizabeth Stride was found first in Dutfield's yard off Berner Street at approximately 1 o'clock on the morning of Sunday the 30th. Her throat had been cut in the now familiar manner, a deep wound running from left to right, severing the major vessels and causing death within seconds. But unlike the previous victims, her body had not been mutilated. Her clothing was undisturbed, her abdomen had not been opened. The killer had been interrupted, most likely by the arrival of Louis Dimschutz, a travelling salesman who lived above the International Working Men's Educational Club that fronted onto Berner Street. Dimschutz had been driving his pony and cart into the yard when his horse shied and refused to proceed. He lit a match and saw something lying against the wall, and realised with horror that it was a woman's body. He ran into the club to raise the alarm, and by the time he returned with help, the killer had vanished into the darkness. The police and the doctors arrived within minutes. Dr. Frederick Blackwell conducted the medical examination and determined that Stride had been dead no more than 20 minutes when her body was found. The blood was still flowing from the wound. The body was still warm. If Dimschutz had arrived 5 minutes earlier, he might have caught the killer in the act. If he had arrived 5 minutes later, he would have found a body mutilated in the manner of the previous victims. But his arrival at precisely the moment when the killer was beginning his work had interrupted the ritual, had prevented the full horror from being enacted, and somewhere in the darkness, the man with the knife had fled, frustrated and angry, still hungry for the satisfaction that had been denied him. Less than an hour later, Catherine Eddowes was found in Mitre Square, 3/4 of a mile from Dutfield's yard. The square was small and quiet, surrounded by warehouses that were closed and empty on a Sunday morning. Eddowes had been released from the Bishopsgate police station at 1 o'clock, having been locked up at her lair in the evening for being drunk and incapable. She had set off into the night to return to her lodgings, but had never arrived. At 1:45, Police Constable Edward Watkins entered Mitre Square on his regular patrol and found her body lying in the southwest corner in the darkest part of the square where the light from the street lamps did not reach. What had been done to Catherine Eddowes exceeded even the mutilations inflicted on Annie Chapman. Her throat had been cut with such violence that the head was nearly severed from the body. Her face had been mutilated, with the nose nearly cut off and the ears damaged. The abdomen had been opened entirely, with organs removed and arranged around the body. The intestines had been pulled out and draped over the right shoulder in a manner identical to Chapman. But the killer had gone further. He had removed the left kidney and part of the uterus, taking them away with him. And most disturbing of all, he had carved triangular flaps of skin from both cheeks, creating wounds that gave the face a grotesque appearance, as though the victim were wearing a mask of her own flesh. Dr. Frederick Gordon Brown, the city police surgeon, conducted the post-mortem examination and concluded that the mutilations had been performed with considerable anatomical skill. The organs had been removed cleanly. The facial mutilations had been deliberate and precise. The killer had worked in near total darkness, in a location where he could have been discovered at any moment, yet had completed his work without leaving any clear evidence of his identity. Brown estimated that the entire sequence of events, from the initial attack to the completion of the mutilations, could have taken no more than 15 minutes. The speed and efficiency suggested someone who knew exactly what he wanted to do and how to do it, someone who had practiced or studied human anatomy, someone who was entirely comfortable working with a knife in the dark. The connection between the two murders was immediately apparent. The killer had been interrupted at Dutfield's yard and had sought another victim to satisfy whatever compulsion drove him. The proximity in time and the similarities in method made it clear that the same man was responsible for both deaths. But it was a discovery made several hours later that truly shocked the investigators and forced them to reconsider the letter that had arrived at the Central News Agency. At approximately 3 o'clock on Sunday morning, a constable named Alfred Long was walking his beat on Goulston Street when he noticed a piece of blood-stained cloth lying in the doorway of a tenement building. He picked it up and recognised it as part of an apron. Further investigation revealed that the cloth had been cut from the apron Catherine Eddowes had been wearing when she died. The killer had used it to wipe his hands or his knife, and then dropped it as he fled through the streets. But it was what was written on the wall above where the apron fragment lay that caused the greatest consternation. Someone had written a message in white chalk on the black fascia of the doorway. The exact wording would later be disputed, as the message was erased before it could be properly photographed, but the most reliable accounts recorded it as reading, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The meaning was unclear, the grammar was confused, but the implication seemed to be that the killer was attempting to deflect blame onto the Jewish community. The East End had a large Jewish population, many of them recent immigrants from Eastern Europe, and anti-Semitic sentiment was already running high in some quarters. Sir Charles Warren, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, ordered the message erased immediately, fearing it would spark riots against Jewish residents. The decision to erase the message was controversial and would be criticised for years afterward, but Warren believed he had no choice. The East End was a powder keg of ethnic tensions, and the murders were providing fuel for those who wanted to blame immigrants and foreigners for the violence plaguing the district. The message on the wall, whether genuine or planted by someone seeking to stir up trouble, could have led to violence against innocent people, but the erasure also meant that valuable evidence was lost, evidence that might have provided insight into the killer's mindset or identity. With 3 murders now committed in the space of 3 weeks, and 4 if one counted Elizabeth Stride as a genuine Ripper victim rather than an interrupted attempt, the Metropolitan Police came under intense pressure to produce results. Questions were asked in Parliament. The Home Secretary demanded daily updates. The press howled for action, and someone at the Central News Agency remembered the letter that had arrived on the 27th of September, the letter signed Jack the Ripper, the letter that had promised to clip the lady's ears off, Catherine Eddowes had not had her ears removed, but her face had been mutilated in a manner that came close to fulfilling that promise. On the 1st of October, the Central News Agency released the letter to the press. The publication created an immediate sensation. Newspapers across London and throughout Britain printed the full text of the letter, along with facsimiles of the handwriting. The name Jack the Ripper entered the public consciousness and would never leave it. The theatrical quality of the letter, with its mockery and its promise of further violence, captured the public imagination in a way that dry police reports never could. Here was a villain worthy of the penny dreadfuls, a figure of melodramatic evil who taunted the authorities and revelled in his crimes. The fact that he might be a hoaxer, that the letter might have been written by a journalist or prankster seeking attention, seemed less important than the narrative it created. Jack the Ripper became real because the name was too perfect, too memorable, too laden with theatrical menace to be anything but the truth. More letters followed. On the 1st of October, a postcard arrived at the Central News Agency, again written in red ink, again signed Jack the Ripper. It read, "I was not codding dear old boss when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow, double event this time. Number 1 squealed a bit, couldn't finish straight off. Had not got time to get ears off for police, thanks for keeping last letter back till I got to work again." The postcard contained details about the double event that had not yet been published, which suggested either genuine inside knowledge or access to police information. The handwriting was similar to the first letter, though not identical, and experts would later debate whether both communications came from the same hand. The police were now caught in an impossible situation. If the letters were genuine, they were dealing with a killer who was not only brutal but also articulate and theatrical, someone who wanted recognition for his crimes and was willing to communicate with the press to ensure he received it. If the letters were hoaxes, they were still shaping public perception of the case and creating a narrative that the police could not control. Either way, the name Jack the Ripper had been bestowed upon the Whitechapel murderer, and it would stick. Future letters would arrive by the hundreds, some clearly fraudulent, others more ambiguous, all of them adding to the mythology that was building around the case. The police would spend countless hours investigating the correspondence, tracing handwriting samples, interviewing suspects who might have written the letters, all to no avail. The autumn deepened and the fog grew thicker, and the name Jack the Ripper was whispered in every corner of the East End. The women who walked the streets at night spoke it with fear and defiance in equal measure. The men who gathered in public houses speculated endlessly about the killer's identity. The newspapers printed fresh theories every day, and somewhere in that vast city, among the millions of souls who called London home, the man with the knife read about himself and smiled. He had a name now, a name that would outlive him, a name that would be remembered when all the respectable citizens of Victorian England had been forgotten. He was Jack the Ripper, and his work was not yet finished. The letter in red ink had been only the beginning. The harvest of blood would continue, and the worst was still to come. Chapter 6. The Double Event. The International Working Men's Educational Club stood at number 40 Burner Street, a narrow thoroughfare that connected Commercial Road to the docks beyond. The club occupied a 2-story building that had once served other purposes, but now housed the meetings and social gatherings of socialist intellectuals, immigrant workers, and political radicals who gathered to discuss the transformation of society and the liberation of the working classes. The ground floor contained a printing office where pamphlets and manifestos were produced in multiple languages. The upper floor served as a meeting hall and social space where members could debate philosophy and politics late into the night. On Saturday, the 29th of September 1888, the club was hosting a discussion and entertainment evening with approximately 100 people in attendance. The meeting had broken up around midnight, with members lingering to talk and smoke and enjoy the fellowship of like-minded souls. By 12:30, most had departed, leaving perhaps 20 people still gathered in the hall. Outside, Burner Street was quiet and dark, the gaslight at the entrance to the club providing the only illumination. A passage ran alongside the club building, leading to Dutfield's yard at the rear, where several cottages stood, and where the club stored various items, including the pony and cart belonging to Louis Demschutz. The passage was narrow and unlit, and at that hour it was as dark as any place in London could be. Elizabeth Stride had been walking the streets since early evening. She was 45 years old, born Elizabeth Gustafsdotter in Sweden in 1843, and had come to London in her youth seeking a better life than rural Scandinavia could provide. She had married John Stride in 1869, and together they had managed a coffee shop on Crisp Street until his death in 1884. Since then she had lived in various lodging houses, supporting herself through charwork and needlework when she could find it, and through prostitution when she could not. On the night of her death she had been staying at a common lodging house on Flower and Dean Street, and had spent the early evening in the Queen's Head public house on Commercial Street in Njumbi, where she was seen by several people who knew her. Around 11 o'clock she had been observed standing in the doorway of the Bricklayer's Arms on Settle Street, speaking with a man. The witness, a labourer named William Marshall, would later describe the man as middle-aged, respectably dressed in a small black cutaway coat and dark trousers. He had heard the man say to Stride that she would say anything but her prayers, and heard her laugh in response. The couple had walked away together toward Berner Street, moving slowly, appearing comfortable in each other's company. Marshall thought nothing of it at the time. Such sights were common in Whitechapel at night, women and their clients negotiating terms or simply passing time together before finding a private place for their transaction. At approximately 12:35, a young clerk named Israel Schwartz was walking along Berner Street when he saw a man stop and speak to a woman who was standing in the gateway to Dutfield's yard. As Schwartz watched, the man attempted to pull the woman into the street, and when she resisted, he threw her down onto the pavement. Schwartz heard the woman scream, but not loudly, more of a protest than a cry for help. He noticed another man standing on the opposite side of the street, lighting his pipe, apparently observing the altercation. Schwartz, frightened and not wanting to become involved, crossed to the other side of the street and hurried away. He heard the second man call out something that sounded like Lipski, a derogatory term sometimes used against Jews. Schwartz, who was himself Jewish, believed the shout was directed at him and ran. He did not look back. He did not see what happened next. What happened next was murder, though no one witnessed the act itself. The woman on the pavement was Elizabeth Stride, and the man who had thrown her down was very likely her killer, though Schwartz could not have known that at the time. The attack must have happened very quickly after Schwartz departed. The man pulled Stride into the passageway, pressed her against the wall, and cut her throat with a single swift stroke. The knife was sharp and the cut was deep, running from left to right, severing the carotid artery in the windpipe. Death would have come within seconds. Stride collapsed to the ground, blood pooling beneath her body, still warm, still flowing when Louis Demschutz arrived 15 minutes later. Demschutz had been working late, selling cheap jewellery at a market in Weston Hill. He returned to Berner Street driving his pony and cart, arriving at approximately 1 o'clock. As he turned into the passageway leading to Dutfield's yard, his pony suddenly shied to the left and refused to go forward. Demschutz assumed there was something on the ground that was frightening the animal, but he could see nothing in the darkness. He struck a match and bent down to look, and saw a woman lying against the wall. He touched her face and found it warm, but did not realize she was dead. He thought perhaps she was drunk or had fainted. He drove his cart into the yard and ran upstairs to fetch his wife, who was inside the club. Together they returned with a candle, and saw immediately that the woman was not drunk but dead, her throat cut, blood still spreading across the stones. Demschutz raised the alarm. Members of the club came running. Someone sent for the police while others gathered around the body, staring in horror at what lay before them. The gaslight from Berner Street cast strange shadows into the passage, illuminating the scene in flickering uncertain light. Elizabeth Stride lay on her left side, her right arm across her chest, her left arm extended. She wore a black jacket and a black skirt, both old and worn. Around her neck was a checked silk scarf, and in her left hand she still clutched a packet of cachous, the small perfumed lozenges that women used to freshen their breath. The blood beneath her body was still wet, still warm. If DM Schutz had arrived 5 minutes earlier, he might have interrupted the killer in the act. If he had arrived 10 minutes later, he might have found a body mutilated beyond recognition. Police Constable Henry Lamb arrived at approximately 1 o'clock, having been summoned by a member of the club who had run to find him. Lamb examined the body and sent immediately for Dr. Frederick Blackwell, who lived on Commercial Road. While they waited for the doctor, more constables arrived, and a crowd began to gather at the entrance to the passage. Word of the murder spread quickly through the neighbourhood, and within minutes dozens of people had congregated on Berner Street, pressing forward to catch a glimpse of the body, speculating about who had done this and why. The police struggled to maintain order and preserve the scene, but in the chaos, much potential evidence was lost or contaminated. Sir Blackwell arrived at approximately 1:10 and conducted his preliminary examination. The victim had been dead no more than 20 minutes. The blood was still flowing sluggishly from the wound. The body was still warm. The cut to the throat was the only injury visible, though Blackwell would conduct a more thorough examination later at the mortuary. There were no signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds on the hands, nothing to suggest that Stride had fought her attacker. The killer had struck swiftly and efficiently, allowing no time for resistance or outcry. The cashews still clutched in her left hand suggested that she had been holding them when attacked, that she had had no warning of what was about to happen. The investigation proceeded according to established procedure. The body was photographed where it lay, then removed to the mortuary at St. George's in the east. The passage and the yard were searched for evidence, yielding little beyond some indistinct marks in the mud that might have been footprints. Witnesses were interviewed, including Louis DM Schutz and Israel Schwartz, though Schwartz's testimony would not become fully known until later. The residents of Berner Street and the surrounding areas were questioned about what they had seen or heard. A description of the suspected killer was circulated based on the accounts of various witnesses, though these descriptions were vague and often contradictory. Middle-aged man, dark clothing, respectable appearance, nothing that would distinguish him from 10,000 other men in London. While the investigation at Dutfield's yard was still in its early stages, the killer was already stalking his next victim. Catherine Eddowes had been released from Bishopsgate Police Station at 1 o'clock, having sobered up sufficiently to be discharged. She gave her name as Mary Ann Kelly when asked, and the desk sergeant recorded that she had been found drunk on Aldgate High Street at 8:30 the previous evening. She was a familiar figure to the police, often arrested for drunkenness, always released the next morning with a warning to behave herself. She was 46 years old, had lived with a man named John Kelly for 7 years in a common lodging house on Flower and Dean Street, and made what living she could through hawking and occasional prostitution. When she left the police station, she turned west, walking toward Mitre Square. What route she took is unknown. Who she encountered along the way is unknown. But sometime between 1 o'clock and 1:30 she met the man who would kill her, and agreed to go with him to the dark corner of Mitre Square where her body would be found. Perhaps he offered her money. Perhaps he simply walked beside her and she, needing coin for her bed, suggested they go somewhere private. Perhaps he said nothing at all, but simply led the way and she followed, as women had been following men into dark places since the beginning of time. Mitre Square was a small cobbled space enclosed by warehouses and commercial buildings. 3 passages led into it, one from Mitre Street, one from Duke Street, and one from St. James's Place. At night, the square was dark and quiet, the warehouses closed and empty, the surrounding buildings housing no residents who might look out and see what was happening below. A single lamp burned at the entrance from Mitre Street, casting a pool of light that did not extend to the southwest corner, where Catherine Eddowes and her killer entered. The square was on the beat of Police Constable Edward Watkins, who passed through it every 14 minutes on his regular patrol. At 1:30, Watkins walked through the square and saw nothing unusual. At 1:44 he returned and found a body lying in the darkest corner. What was done to Catherine Eddowes in those 40 minutes exceeded anything that had been done to the previous victims. The killer worked with speed and precision, cutting her throat so deeply that the head was nearly severed. then opening the abdomen with a long vertical incision running from the breastbone to the pelvis. He pulled out the intestines and draped them over the right shoulder. He removed the left kidney and part of the uterus, placing them in his pocket or perhaps in a cloth he had brought for that purpose. He mutilated the face, cutting away triangular pieces of skin from both cheeks, slicing the nose, cutting the eyelids. He carved a series of superficial cuts across the abdomen, creating patterns that suggested some meaning known only to himself. And then, with Constable Watkins due to return at any moment, he wiped his hands on Catherine Eddowes's apron, cut away a piece of the fabric, and vanished into the darkness. Watkins saw the body from across the square and ran to it, blowing his whistle to summon assistance. Within minutes, other constables arrived, along with Dr. Frederick Gordon Brown and Dr. George William Sequeira, who both lived nearby. They examined the body by lantern light and saw immediately that this was not simply murder, but something approaching surgical dissection. The organs had been removed with skill. The facial mutilations were deliberate and precise. The killer had worked in near total darkness, with the possibility of discovery at any moment, yet had completed his task without leaving any clear evidence. The only clue was the piece of apron, which would be found several hours later in Goulston Street, along with the chalk message on the wall that may or may not have been written by the killer. The double event, as it came to be called, marked the peak of the Ripper's visible activity. 2 women dead within an hour, 1 murder interrupted. The second carried out with enhanced fury, as though the killer needed to compensate for what had been denied him at Dutfield's yard. The pattern was now undeniable. The Metropolitan Police could no longer dismiss these killings as isolated incidents or the work of multiple perpetrators. A single man is responsible, a man who killed with increasing confidence and brutality, a man who seemed to move through the streets of Whitechapel like a ghost, striking without warning and vanishing without trace. The investigation intensified. More police were assigned to the case, patrols were increased, suspects were arrested and questioned and released. But the killer remained free, and the women of Whitechapel remained terrified, and the autumn night pressed closer around them all. Chapter 7. The City in Fear. The morning of Sunday, the 30th of September, dawned cold and grey over London. By the time the sun had fully risen, news of the double murder had spread through Whitechapel and beyond, carried by word of mouth and by newspaper boys shouting the latest editions in the streets. The Sunday papers devoted their front pages to the killings, printing every detail they could gather, embellishing where facts were scarce, speculating wildly about the identity and motives of the man the press was now universally calling Jack the Ripper. The name had taken hold with remarkable speed, displacing earlier appellations like the Whitechapel Murderer or the Leather Apron. Jack the Ripper possessed a theatrical quality that captured the public imagination, a name that suggested both familiarity and menace, a villain who might have stepped from the pages of a sensation novel. The residents of the East End responded to the news with a mixture of terror and anger. Women who had walked the streets every night for years now refused to go out after dark unless accompanied by others. The common lodging houses filled earlier each evening as residents sought safety in numbers, preferring the crowded squalor of the dormitories to the dangerous solitude of the streets. Public houses reported increased business as people gathered to drink and talk and speculate about the murders, finding comfort in companionship and gin. But beneath the surface of ordinary life ran a current of fear that no amount of alcohol could entirely suppress. The killer had struck twice in one night. He had demonstrated that he could move through the heart of Whitechapel undetected, could kill and mutilate and vanish without leaving clear evidence. If he could do this once, he could do it again, and no one knew where or when he would strike next. The police presence in Whitechapel increased dramatically in the days following the double event. The Metropolitan Police assigned additional constables to patrol the streets between dusk and dawn, with orders to stop and question any man seen in the company of a woman who appeared to be a prostitute. Plainclothes detectives mingled with the crowds in public houses and on street corners, listening for information, watching for suspicious behaviour, officers stood at fixed points throughout the district, maintaining visibility in the hope that their presence might deter the killer, or at least reassure the public that something was being done. But the streets of Whitechapel formed such an intricate maze, with so many dark courts and passages and alleyways, that even a substantial police presence could not guarantee safety. The killer needed only a few minutes of privacy to complete his work, and such privacy was always available to those who knew where to look. The investigation itself was being coordinated from Scotland Yard, with Chief Inspector Donald Swanson assigned overall command of the case. Swanson was an experienced detective who had handled numerous complex investigations, but nothing in his career had prepared him for the scale and intensity of the Ripper inquiry. Hundreds of statements needed to be taken from witnesses and neighbours and anyone who might have relevant information. Dozens of suspects were being identified and investigated, each requiring careful attention, even though most could be quickly eliminated. The correspondence arriving at Scotland Yard and various newspapers had to be reviewed and analysed, searching for any communication that might be genuine rather than one more hoax. Medical evidence had to be coordinated between multiple doctors who had examined the bodies and the crime scenes, and all of this had to be done while managing intense pressure from the Home Office, the press, and a public that demanded immediate results. Inspector Abberline, who had extensive experience in Whitechapel from his years working in H Division, was recalled from Central Office to assist with the investigation. Abberline knew the district intimately, knew its geography and its inhabitants, knew which informants could be trusted and which criminals might have useful information. He established a presence at Commercial Street Police Station and began the painstaking work of following up on every lead, no matter how unlikely. He interviewed prostitutes and lodging house keepers, publicans and market traders, anyone who moved through the streets at night and might have seen something unusual. Most had nothing useful to report. A few provided descriptions of men seen with the victim shortly before their deaths, but these descriptions were so vague and contradictory that they were nearly useless. A middle-aged man of medium height wearing dark clothes described perhaps 100,000 men in London on any given night. The City of London Police, who had jurisdiction over Mitre Square where Catherine Eddowes was killed, conducted their own parallel investigation under the direction of his detective inspector, James McWilliam. The City Police were a separate force from the Metropolitan Police, and there was some tension between the two organisations over how the investigation should be coordinated. McWilliam focused on tracing the movements of Catherine Eddowes in the hours before her death, interviewing the police officers who had arrested and released her, searching for anyone who might have seen her between the time she left Bishopsgate Police Station and the time her body was found. He also pursued the lead provided by the piece of apron found in Goulston Street, though this was technically a Metropolitan Police territory, creating additional jurisdictional complications. The press played an increasingly prominent role in shaping public perception of the investigation. Reporters from dozens of newspapers descended on Whitechapel, interviewing residents, attending inquests, speculating endlessly about the killer's identity and motives. The coverage ranged from sober factual reporting in respectable papers like The Times to lurid sensationalism in the penny press. The Illustrated Police News published graphic illustrations of the crime scenes and the victims' bodies, rendered in woodcut with a level of detail that would be considered shocking even by modern standards. The Star newspaper employed correspondents who prowled the East End at night, filing dramatic dispatches that emphasised the danger and degradation of the district. The coverage served to further terrify the public while simultaneously creating a market for news about the murders that encouraged ever more sensational reporting. The inquests into the deaths of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes provided additional forums for public discussion of the murders. The Stride inquest was held at the Vestry Hall in Cable Street, with Wynne Baxter presiding as coroner. The proceedings stretched over multiple sessions in early October, with witnesses testifying to what they had seen and heard on the night of the murder. Louis Diemschutz described finding the body in Dutfield's yard. Dr. Frederick Blackwell provided medical testimony about the nature of the throat wound and his conclusion that death had been nearly instantaneous. Israel Schwartz gave his account of seeing a man throw a woman to the ground outside the entrance to the yard, though his testimony raised more questions than it answered. Who was the second man Schwartz had seen across the street? What did the shout of Lipsky signify? Was the man Schwartz saw actually the killer, or simply someone involved in an unrelated altercation? The inquest into Catherine Eddowes' death was held at the City Coroner's Court, with Samuel Frederick Langham presiding. The medical testimony in this case was particularly detailed and disturbing. Dr. Frederick Gordon Brown described the extensive mutilations inflicted on the body, the removal of organs, the facial injuries that suggested a deliberate attempt to disfigure. He testified that the killer possessed considerable anatomical knowledge and surgical skill, and had worked with remarkable speed and precision given the circumstances. The jury heard testimony from Police Constable Watkins about finding the body, from other officers about the search for evidence, from witnesses who had seen Eddowes earlier in the evening. The piece of apron found in Goulston Street was entered into evidence, along with the description of the chalk message that had been written on the wall above it. Both inquests returned verdicts of willful murder by person or persons unknown, the only conclusion possible given the lack of any identified suspect. As October began, the residents of Whitechapel organised their own response to the crisis. Vigilance committees were formed in various neighbourhoods, groups of local men who volunteered to patrol the streets at night carrying clubs and lanterns. The largest and most organised of these was the Mile End Vigilance Committee, led by a builder named George Lusk. The committee consisted of tradesmen and local residents who believed the police were not doing enough to protect the community. They organised nightly patrols through the most dangerous areas, challenged suspicious-looking men, and generally tried to create a visible presence that might deter the killer. The police viewed these efforts with mixed feelings, grateful for public engagement but concerned that amateur vigilantes might interfere with the investigation or attack innocent men based on nothing more than suspicion. The committee also raised money to offer a reward for information leading to the killer's capture. The government had refused to offer an official reward, believing that such offers tended to generate false information from people seeking the money. But private citizens had no such constraints, and the Vigilance Committee collected several £100s that was pledged as a reward for useful information. Notices were printed and posted throughout the district offering money to anyone who could provide information that would lead to the arrest and conviction of the Whitechapel murderer. The offer generated numerous responses, most of them worthless, but it demonstrated the community's determination to take action in the face of official inadequacy. The Home Secretary, Henry Matthews, faced increasing criticism in Parliament and in the press for his handling of the crisis. Questions were asked about police competence, about the adequacy of resources devoted to the investigation, about whether the government was taking the murders seriously because the victims were poor prostitutes rather than respectable citizens. Matthews defended the police and insisted that everything possible was being done, but his assurances satisfied few. Sir Charles Warren, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, also came under fire for his decision to erase the chalk message in Goulston Street before it could be properly photographed. Warren maintained that he had acted to prevent potential riots against the Jewish community, but critics argued that he had destroyed valuable evidence that might have helped identify the killer. The medical community became involved in the debate over the killer's identity. The skill demonstrated in removing organs and the apparent anatomical knowledge suggested to some that the murderer might be a doctor or medical student. Dr. Thomas Bond, a police surgeon who reviewed the medical evidence, disagreed with this assessment, arguing that the mutilation showed no special surgical skill, but rather a kind of frenzied brutality that any determined person with a sharp knife could accomplish. But the theory persisted that the Ripper had medical training, perhaps even worked in one of the hospitals or medical schools that dotted the East End. This theory led to investigations of various doctors and medical students, including several who worked at the London Hospital on Whitechapel Road, though none of these inquiries produced a viable suspect. The immigrant community, particularly Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, faced increasing hostility as rumours spread that the killer might be a foreigner. The message in Goulston Street, with its reference to Jews, had planted the suggestion that the murders were somehow connected to the Jewish community. The fact that several of the witnesses had described the man seen with victims as having a foreign appearance added fuel to these suspicions. Anti-Semitic propaganda began to circulate, with some voices arguing that the murders were part of a Jewish ritual or conspiracy. Local Jewish leaders condemned the murders and cooperated fully with the police investigation, but they could not prevent the rising tide of prejudice that threatened to engulf their community. As the days passed without another murder, a strange calm settled over Whitechapel. The killer had struck 5 times in little more than 2 months, if one counted Martha Tabram as his first victim, or 4 times if one began the count with Mary Ann Nichols. The pattern had been escalating, with the mutilations becoming more extensive and the frequency increasing. But now, as October moved toward its midpoint, the streets remained quiet. The extra police patrols continued. The vigilance committees maintained their watch. The women who had to walk at night did so with fear, staying in groups when possible, avoiding the darkest courts and alleys, and everyone waited, knowing that the silence could not last forever, that somewhere in the maze of streets and passages, the man with the knife was waiting for his next opportunity. The city held its breath. The fog rolled in from the Thames each evening thick and yellow, reducing visibility to a few feet and muffling all sound. The autumn was deepening toward winter. The nights were growing longer and colder, and in the darkness of Whitechapel, 5 women were already dead, their bodies mutilated beyond recognition, their lives reduced to brief paragraphs in police reports and newspaper articles. The fear that had settled over the district was palpable, a living presence that walked the streets alongside the residents and the police and the killer himself. No one knew when he would strike again, no one knew who would be next, and in that uncertainty, in that terrible waiting, the city learned what it meant to live in the shadow of a monster who killed without pattern or mercy or any discernible motive beyond the act of killing itself. Chapter 8. The American doctor, Francis Tumblety, arrived in London in the spring of 1888, though he had visited the city several times before during his long and peculiar career as a medical charlatan. He was 55 years old that year, a tall man with an imposing physical presence, standing well over 6 feet in height with broad shoulders and a military bearing that he cultivated through careful attention to his appearance. He wore his hair long and sported an elaborate moustache that he waxed to sharp points. His clothing was expensive and eccentric, favouring military-style coats adorned with gold braid, high boots polished to a mirror shine, and jewellery that caught the light and drew attention. He moved through the world with the confidence of a man who had spent decades convincing others of his importance, and who had learned that bold assertion of authority could substitute for actual credentials. Tumblety called himself a doctor, though he had never attended medical school or obtained any legitimate medical qualification. He had been born in Ireland around 1833 and had come to America as a child when his family emigrated to Rochester, New York. By his 20s, he had begun styling himself as an Indian herb doctor, selling patent medicines and providing medical consultations to anyone willing to pay his fees. He travelled extensively throughout the United States and Canada, setting up practice in various cities, always staying one step ahead of the authorities who periodically investigated his claims and qualifications. He had been arrested multiple times on charges ranging from fraud to performing illegal abortions, though he always managed to escape serious punishment through a combination of legal manoeuvring and strategic departure to new locations. His medical practice, such as it was, relied heavily on dramatic presentation and psychological manipulation. He maintained elaborate consulting rooms decorated with anatomical specimens preserved in jars of alcohol. He claimed to possess secret knowledge of herbs and remedies unknown to conventional physicians. He charged exorbitant fees for his consultations and his medicines, catering to wealthy patients who were drawn to his theatrical style and his promises of cures that orthodox medicine could not provide. Among his collection of preserved specimens were human organs, particularly uteri that he claimed to have removed during various surgical procedures. He displayed these specimens prominently in his consulting rooms and spoke of them with a mixture of scientific detachment an obvious fascination that some visitors found unsettling. Tumblety had another aspect to his life that he kept carefully hidden from public view. He was homosexual, at a time when such desires were not merely socially unacceptable, but criminally prosecuted throughout the British Empire and in most of the United States. The Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885 had made acts of gross indecency between men punishable by up to 2 years of hard labour, and prosecutions under this law were becoming increasingly common. Tumblety managed his sexual life with extreme caution, maintaining a public persona of aggressive masculinity while conducting his private affairs in the shadows. He expressed open hatred of women, particularly prostitutes, and some who knew him reported that he seemed to blame women for the corruption of men, as though female sexuality itself was a contagion that spread moral disease. In London during the spring and summer of 1888, Tumblety established himself in lodgings at 22 Batty Street in the heart of Whitechapel. The location placed him within walking distance of all the murder sites, though this fact would not become significant until later. He continued his medical practice, such as it was, seeing patients and selling his preparations. He moved through the district with his usual flamboyant style, impossible to overlook, memorable to anyone who encountered him. Whether he knew the geography of Whitechapel before taking lodgings there, or whether he learned it during his residence, remains unknown. But by the autumn he certainly knew the maze of streets and courts, knew which alleys led where, knew the rhythms of police patrols and the habits of the women who walked at night. On the 7th of November, Tumblety was arrested at his lodgings on charges of gross indecency. The arrest followed an investigation by the Metropolitan Police into allegations that Tumblety had engaged in homosexual acts with several young men. The charges were serious enough to warrant imprisonment pending trial, and Tumblety was held at Marlborough Street Police Station before being moved to other facilities. He appeared before magistrates on the 14th of November, and bail was set at the substantial sum of £300. Tumblety somehow managed to raise the bail money, possibly through contacts in the medical or business community who knew him, possibly through his own resources accumulated over decades of medical fraud. He was released on bail on the 16th of November, with the understanding that he would appear for trial at a later date. He did not appear for trial. Instead, within days of his release, Tumblety fled England entirely. He travelled to France, where he boarded a steamship bound for New York, departing from Le Havre on the 20th of November. His departure was noted by Scotland Yard, which sent a telegram to the New York Police Department alerting them that Tumblety was returning to America and requesting that he be kept under observation. The telegram suggested that Tumblety was a person of interest in the Whitechapel murders investigation, though it did not explicitly accuse him of being Jack the Ripper. The request for surveillance indicated that British authorities had suspicions about Tumblety that went beyond the gross indecency charges for which he had been arrested. The timing of Tumblety's arrest and flight was significant. The most recent Ripper murder, that of Mary Jane Kelly, had occurred on the 9th of November, just 2 days after Tumblety was taken into custody. If Tumblety was indeed the Ripper, then his arrest would explain why the murders ceased after Kelly's death. If he was not the Ripper, then the coincidence of timing was merely that, a coincidence. But the Metropolitan Police clearly considered Tumblety worthy of serious investigation, and his flight from England only deepened their suspicions. A man who was innocent of murder but guilty only of homosexual acts might have fled to escape prosecution and imprisonment, but such flight also suggested a man with secrets to hide and reasons to avoid further police scrutiny. The evidence against Tumblety was largely circumstantial, but nonetheless compelling to those who believed him capable of the crimes. He had been in London during the murders, residing in Whitechapel itself. He possessed medical knowledge, or at least claimed to possess such knowledge, and had demonstrated familiarity with human anatomy through his collection of preserved organs. He had expressed particular interest in female reproductive organs, displaying specimens in his consulting rooms and speaking of them in ways that suggested obsessive fascination. He had voiced hatred of women, and particularly of prostitutes, describing them as sources of corruption and disease. His physical appearance matched some of the descriptions given by witnesses, who had seen men with the victims, though the descriptions were so vague that they could have matched thousands of men. More suggestive was Tumblety's collection of preserved uteri. Several visitors to his consulting rooms in various cities had reported seeing jars containing wombs that Tumblety claimed to have removed during medical procedures. The collection was extensive enough to be remarkable, and Tumblety's pride in displaying it suggested more than simply professional interest. Two of the Ripper victims, Annie Chapman and Catherine Eddowes, had had their uteri removed by the killer. If Tumblety was collecting such organs, if he had some psychological compulsion to possess them, then the removal of organs from the victims would fit a pattern of behaviour that preceded the murders. The organs taken from Chapman and Eddowes had never been recovered. They could easily have been added to Tumblety's collection, preserved in alcohol, displayed alongside the others in some private space where no police would think to search. The theory that the Ripper might be an American was not without precedent. Several witnesses had described hearing men with American accents in the vicinity of the murders. The theatrical quality of the crimes, the taunting letters sent to newspapers, the nickname Jack the Ripper itself, all seemed to fit an American sensibility more than a British one. Americans were seen by many Londoners as brash and violent, given to dramatic gestures and sensational behaviour, less constrained by the rigid class structures and social conventions that governed British society. If the Ripper was indeed an American, and particularly if he was someone like Tumblety who combined medical pretensions with obvious psychological abnormality, then it would explain certain aspects of the crimes that seemed inconsistent with a local killer. But there were also significant problems with Tumblety as a suspect. His physical appearance was so distinctive that he could hardly have moved through Whitechapel without being noticed and remembered. He stood well over 6 feet tall and dressed in flamboyant military-style clothing that drew attention wherever he went. The witnesses who had described men seen with the victims had generally described ordinary-looking men of medium height wearing dark clothing, men who could blend into a crowd and disappear without trace. Tumblety was the opposite of inconspicuous. If he had been wandering the streets of Whitechapel at night in his usual costume, multiple witnesses would have come forward to identify him. The fact that no one did suggests either that Tumblety was not the killer, or that he had somehow managed to disguise his appearance when hunting, adopting shabby clothing and a less memorable demeanour. The timeline of Tumblety's presence in London also raised questions. He had certainly been in the city during the autumn murders, but there was no clear evidence placing him in London during the earlier killings of Martha Tabram and possibly Emma Smith. If these women were Ripper victims and the count began in April rather than August, then Tumblety's arrival in the spring of 1888 would align with the start of the murder series. But if Tabram and Smith were killed by different men, and the true Ripper series began only with Mary Ann Nichols in late August, then Tumblety's presence in London from the spring onward was less significant. The uncertainty about when the murder series actually began made it difficult to evaluate Tumblety's candidacy based on timeline alone. After his arrival in New York, Tumblety was indeed placed under surveillance by the police, acting on the request from Scotland Yard. Detectives followed him as he moved about the city, noting his contacts and activities. But the surveillance was loose and easily evaded, and after several weeks the New York police concluded that Tumblety posed no immediate threat and discontinued their watch. Tumblety continued his career as a medical charlatan, moving from city to city as he had always done, eventually settling in St. Louis where he lived until his death in 1903. He never returned to England, he never faced trial on the gross indecency charges, and he never publicly addressed the suspicions that he might have been Jack the Ripper, maintaining silence on the subject for the remaining 15 years of his life. The question of whether Francis Tumblety was Jack the Ripper would be debated for more than a century after his death. Documents released in later years would reveal that he was indeed a serious suspect in the eyes of at least some Scotland Yard officials. Chief Inspector John Littlechild, who headed the special branch during the Ripper investigation, would later write in a letter that Tumblety was among the suspects, describing him as a very likely candidate. But other senior investigators, including Inspector Abberline, apparently did not share this conviction, or at least left no record of considering Tumblety a strong suspect. The evidence remained circumstantial, suggestive but not conclusive, pointing toward possibility but never reaching certainty. In Whitechapel, as October moved toward November, the residents knew nothing of Francis Tumblety or the suspicion surrounding him. They knew only that the murders had stopped after the double event at the end of September, and that each day without a fresh killing brought cautious hope that perhaps the nightmare had ended. The extra police patrols continued. The vigilance committees maintained their watches. The women who walked at night remained vigilant, travelling in groups, avoiding the darkest places, praying that the man with the knife had moved on or died, or simply lost interest in his terrible work. The fog came and went. The autumn deepened toward winter, and the city waited, holding its breath, knowing that the silence might be only temporary, that the next scream might come at any moment from any dark corner of the East End. The American doctor, if he was guilty, had escaped justice and fled across the ocean, and if he was innocent, then the real killer remained somewhere in London, anonymous and undetected, walking the same streets as everyone else, indistinguishable from any other man. Chapter 9. The Final Horror. Mary Jane Kelly was younger than the other women who died that autumn. She was 25 years old in November of 1888, or perhaps 24, for the details of her early life remained vague and contradictory even to those who knew her. She claimed to have been born in Limerick, Ireland, and to have come to Wales as a child when her family moved to Carmarthenshire. She said her father had worked in an iron foundry, that she had married young to a collier named Davies who had died in a mining explosion, that she had drifted to London seeking work after her husband's death. How much of this was true and how much was invention created to make her life story more sympathetic to clients remained unclear. She might have been Irish, or she might have been Welsh, or she might have come from somewhere else entirely. Such reinvention was common among women who worked the streets, creating pasts that were more bearable than the actual circumstances that had brought them to prostitution. What was known with certainty was that Mary Jane Kelly had been living in London for several years by the autumn of 1888, and that she had worked as a prostitute in the West End before coming to Whitechapel. She was described by those who knew her as an attractive woman, tall for her age at perhaps 5 feet 7 inches, with blonde hair and blue eyes and a fair complexion that had not yet been entirely ruined by drink and hardship. She dressed better than most of the women who walked the streets of the East End, sometimes affecting a jauntier appearance with colourful shawls and better quality boots. She drank heavily, as most of the street women did, but she was also known for being pleasant and good-humoured when sober, singing Irish songs in the public houses she frequented, maintaining friendships with other women in the lodging houses. Since the spring of 1888, she had been living in a small room at 13 Miller's Court, a narrow passageway that ran between 26 and 27 Dorset Street. The passage was barely 12 feet wide and led to a courtyard where 6 small rooms opened off a common area. Kelly's room was the last one on the right, a single space measuring approximately 12 feet by 10 feet, with a fireplace, 2 windows that faced the court and a door that opened directly into the passage. The room contained a bed, a small table, and a chair, with hooks on the wall for hanging clothes. The windows were broken and had been stuffed with rags to keep out the cold. The rent was 4 shillings 6 per week, payable to John McCarthy, who owned several properties on Dorset Street and served as landlord to the poorest of the poor. Kelly was 29 shillings in arrears, having failed to pay rent for several weeks, though McCarthy had not yet evicted her. She shared the room, at least intermittently, with a man named Joseph Barnett, who worked as a fish porter at a Billingsgate market when work was available. Barnett had been living with Kelly since the previous year, helping to pay the rent and apparently maintaining what passed for a domestic relationship in the slums of Whitechapel, but the arrangement had deteriorated in recent weeks. Barnett had lost his job and could no longer contribute to the rent. Kelly had begun bringing other women back to the room to stay overnight, a practice that Barnett disliked. On the 30th of October they had quarrelled seriously, and Barnett had moved out, taking his few possessions with him. He continued to visit Kelly regularly, stopping by to give her what money he could spare, but he no longer slept in the room on Miller's Court. This meant that Kelly was now alone at night, responsible for earning enough to cover the rent she already owed, plus the new rent coming due each week, with no other source of income except what she could earn by walking the streets. The evening of Thursday the 8th of November found Kelly drinking in the Britannia public house at the corner of Dorset Street and Commercial Street, establishment she frequented regularly. She was seen there by several people who knew her, including Barnett, who'd stopped by to give her some money. She appeared to be in good spirits despite her financial difficulties, singing and talking with other customers. At some point during the evening, she left the public house and returned to her room, possibly bringing a client with her, possibly alone. What happened during the rest of the evening and the early hours of Friday morning would have to be reconstructed from fragmentary witness accounts that were often contradictory and unreliable. Several residents of Miller's Court would later testify to hearing sounds from Kelly's room during the night. Elizabeth Prater, who lived in the room directly above Kelly's, said she had returned to her room around 1:30 on Friday morning and had heard no unusual sounds at that time. She had fallen asleep quickly, exhausted from her own night's work. Sometime between 3:30 and 4 o'clock, she was awakened by what sounded like a faint cry of murder. But such cries were not uncommon in the courts and lodging houses of Whitechapel, and Prater had rolled over and gone back to sleep without investigating. Sarah Lewis, who was staying with friends in another room in Miller's Court that night, also reported hearing a cry around 3:30, a woman's voice calling out once, and then falling silent. Like Prater, Lewis had thought nothing of it at the time, and had not gotten up to look. Mary Ann Cox, who lived at number 5 Miller's Court, had seen Kelly return to her room around 11:45 on Thursday night. Kelly had been accompanied by a man, short and stout, with a blotchy face and a thick carroty moustache, wearing shabby dark clothing and carrying a pot of ale. Kelly had been very drunk, barely able to walk straight, singing a song called "Only a Violet I Plucked from Mother's Grave." Cox had bid them good night and gone to her own room. She'd gone out again around midnight and had heard Kelly still singing when she passed. She had returned at 3 o'clock and the room had been silent, no light showing from the windows, no sound of movement inside. This was the last reliable sighting of Mary Jane Kelly alive. At 10:45 on Friday morning, John McCarthy sent his assistant Thomas Bowyer to collect the rent that Kelly owed. Bowyer walked down the passage to Miller's Court and knocked on Kelly's door, calling out her name. There was no response. He tried the door and found it locked. The windows were covered with makeshift curtains of old clothing that blocked any view inside. But one of the windows had a broken pane, covered with only a thin rag that could be pushed aside. Bowyer reached through the broken window and moved the curtain, peering into the room. What he saw sent him running back to McCarthy's shop, his face white with shock, barely able to articulate what he had witnessed. McCarthy accompanied Bowyer back to Miller's Court and looked through the window himself. Then he sent Bowyer to fetch the police while he remained outside the door, ensuring that no one entered the room or tampered with the scene. Inspector Walter Beck arrived within minutes, looked through the window, and immediately sent for more senior officers and for the divisional surgeon. Inspector Frederick Abberline arrived shortly afterward, along with Superintendent Thomas Arnold and numerous other officials. Dr. George Bagster Phillips, who had examined the bodies of Annie Chapman and other victims, came to conduct the medical examination. But before anyone could enter the room, a decision had to be made about whether to break down the door or wait for bloodhounds. Sir Charles Warren had recently arranged for bloodhounds to be available for use in tracking criminals, and there had been talk of using them in the Ripper investigation. The dogs were reportedly capable of following a scent trail from a crime scene to a suspect's location, but the dogs were not immediately available, and no one knew if they could actually perform as promised. The police stood outside Mary Jane Kelly's door for more than an hour, debating whether to break it down or wait for dogs that might never arrive. Finally, at 1:30 in the afternoon, Superintendent Arnold ordered the door forced open. A pickaxe was obtained, and the lock was broken. The door swung inward, and the police entered the room where Mary Jane Kelly had died. What they found exceeded anything that had been done to the previous victims. Kelly lay on the bed, on her back, entirely naked, except for a thin chemise that had been pushed up around her neck. The bedsheet beneath her was soaked with blood. Her throat had been cut down to the spine, nearly severing the head from the body. Her face had been mutilated beyond recognition, with the nose cut off. The cheeks carved away, the ears partially removed. Her breasts had been cut off and placed on the table beside the bed. Her abdomen had been opened entirely, with the intestines pulled out and arranged on the bed beside her. The liver had been removed and placed between her feet. The uterus, the kidneys, and one breast had been removed and were found under the bed. The flesh had been stripped from the thighs down to the bone. The heart was missing, never to be recovered. The killer had spent hours in that room. He had locked the door from the inside, ensuring he would not be interrupted. He had lit a fire in the fireplace, burning Kelly's clothing to provide light and perhaps to destroy evidence. The glow from the fire would have illuminated his work as he systematically destroyed the woman on the bed, cutting and carving and arranging her remains in what seemed like a grotesque parody of an anatomical dissection. He had worked methodically, taking organs and placing them in specific locations, creating a tableau that suggested ritual significance, though what that significance might have been remained unclear. When he was finished, he'd calmly washed his hands, extinguished the fire, and left through the door, somehow managing to lock it behind him from the outside despite the primitive nature of the lock. Dr. Phillips conducted his preliminary examination at the scene and concluded that Kelly had been dead for at least 6 hours, possibly longer. The extensive nature of the mutilations meant that establishing an exact time of death was difficult. The body had been cold when discovered, but the fire in the room would have maintained warmth for some time after the killer departed. Based on the witness accounts of cries heard around 3:30 in the morning, Phillips estimated that Kelly had been killed between 2 and 4 o'clock, with the mutilations performed over the following hours as the killer worked undisturbed in his private charnel house. The body was photographed where it lay, creating images that would become among the most notorious crime scene photographs in history. Then Kelly's remains were removed to the mortuary for a full post-mortem examination. The inquest was held at the Shoreditch Town Hall on Monday the 12th of November, with Dr. Roderick MacDonald presiding as coroner. The proceedings were brief, with only a handful of witnesses called to testify. The coroner seemed eager to conclude the inquest quickly, possibly to spare public sensibilities from the full horror of what had been done to Kelly, possibly because the medical evidence was so overwhelming that extended testimony was unnecessary. The jury viewed Kelly's body at the mortuary and were visibly shaken by what they saw. They returned a verdict of willful murder by person or persons unknown, adding a rider that criticised the absence of a senior police officer to give evidence about the investigation's progress. The murder of Mary Jane Kelly represented the culmination of the Ripper's work, the most extensive mutilation performed on any of his victims, the clearest demonstration of what he was capable of when given time and privacy. It also marked the end of the murder series, at least as far as anyone could determine. No more victims would be killed in the same manner. No more bodies would be found with throats cut and organs removed. The Ripper, if he was still alive, had stopped killing or had moved elsewhere, or had died himself. The theories would be endless. Perhaps he had committed suicide after Kelly, overwhelmed by what he'd done. Perhaps he had been confined to an asylum, his madness finally becoming apparent to those around him. Perhaps he had fled the country, as Francis Tumblety had done. Perhaps he was in prison for some other crime, or had died of natural causes, or had simply decided his work was complete. Mary Jane Kelly was buried on Monday the 19th of November at the Catholic Cemetery in Leytonstone. Her funeral was one of the largest ever seen in the East End, with thousands of people lining the streets to watch the procession pass. The coffin was covered with flowers sent by sympathisers from across London and beyond. The mourners included Joseph Barnett and many of Kelly's friends from the lodging houses and public houses of Whitechapel. The grave was deep and the coffin was lowered gently, and as the first earth fell upon the polished wood, the crowd stood silent in the November cold. She had been 25 years old, or perhaps 24, and she had died more horribly than anyone should die, transformed in her final hours from a human being into raw material for a killer's obsession. The autumn of blood had claimed its last official victim, and winter was descending upon London like a shroud. Chapter 10. The Silence That Followed. The winter of 1888 arrived early and cold, bringing frost to the streets of Whitechapel and ice to the Thames. The last leaves fell from the few trees that grew in the district's cramped spaces, and the fog that rose from the river each evening grew thicker and more persistent, reducing visibility to arm's length and turning the familiar streets into alien landscapes where sound was muffled and distance became impossible to judge. The women who had to walk those streets at night did so with continued fear, knowing that the silence since Mary Jane Kelly's death on the 9th of November might be only temporary, that the killer might strike again at any moment with the same terrible efficiency he had demonstrated throughout the autumn. But as November gave way to December, and December moved toward the new year, and no fresh murders occurred, the terror that had gripped the East End began slowly to subside, replaced by a wary hope that perhaps the nightmare had truly ended. The police continued their investigation with diminished intensity but stubborn persistence. Inspector Frederick Abberline remained assigned to the case, following up on leads that arrived with each post, interviewing suspects who were brought to his attention by informants or anonymous letters, maintaining the patient, methodical approach that had characterized his work throughout the crisis. But the trail had grown cold, if indeed there had ever been a trail that could be followed. The hundreds of statements taken from witnesses had produced no clear description of the killer that could be relied upon. The medical evidence, while extensive, pointed in multiple directions depending on which expert was consulted. The letters that continued to arrive, signed with various versions of Jack the Ripper's name, were almost certainly hoaxes written by attention seekers or disturbed individuals with no connection to the actual crimes. Chief Inspector Donald Swanson compiled a comprehensive report on the investigation, documenting every aspect of the case from the discovery of the first body to the most recent developments. The report filled hundreds of pages, meticulously organized, cross-referenced, and indexed for the future consultation. It represented the culmination of thousands of hours of police work, interviews with hundreds of witnesses, investigation of dozens of suspects, coordination between multiple police divisions and medical examiners. And yet, for all its thoroughness, the report reached no definitive conclusion about the killer's identity. It presented the facts as they were known, the theories that had been pursued, the reasons why various suspects had been eliminated or remained under suspicion. But it could not name the murderer, could not close the case, could not provide the resolution that the public demanded and the victims deserved. The major suspects who had emerged during the investigation remained under varying degrees of suspicion. John Pizer, the bootmaker known as Leather Apron, who had been arrested early in the inquiry, had been definitively cleared of involvement in the murders. His alibis for the key dates were solid, and the initial accusations against him had been based on nothing more than prejudice and rumour. Montague John Druitt, a barrister and schoolmaster who committed suicide by drowning himself in the Thames in December 1888, would later be considered a strong suspect by some investigators, though there was no clear evidence connecting him to the crimes beyond the suspicious timing of his death. Michael Ostrog, a Russian-born confidence trickster and thief who was in and out of asylums and prisons during the relevant period, appeared on some lists of suspects but could not be definitively placed in Whitechapel during the murders. Aaron Kosminski, a Polish Jew who lived in the district and was eventually committed to an asylum in 1891, would be named by some senior officers as a likely candidate, though again the evidence was circumstantial and ambiguous. The truth was that the Metropolitan Police, despite their extensive investigation and the enormous resources devoted to the case, had failed to identify Jack the Ripper. This failure was not due to lack of effort or incompetence, though critics then and later would level both accusations. The simple reality was that the killer had left almost no physical evidence at the crime scenes. He had worked in darkness, in locations where he could not be observed, with sufficient speed that he was gone before anyone could respond to any sounds the victims might have made. He had not been caught with blood on his clothing or a knife in his possession. He had not confessed to anyone, or if he had, that person had never come forward. He had not fit any clear profile that would have allowed the police to narrow their search to a manageable pool of suspects. He had been, in the most literal sense, a ghost, moving through Whitechapel, leaving only corpses behind as the evidence of his presence. The Home Office eventually conducted an internal review of the police handling of the case, examining whether different approaches might have yielded better results. The review was generally supportive of the investigation's methods, but did note some deficiencies in coordination between different police divisions and in the preservation of evidence at crime scenes. The decision to erase the chalk message in Goulston Street was criticised, as was the delay in breaking into Mary Jane Kelly's room. But these were relatively minor issues in the context of an investigation that had faced nearly insurmountable obstacles from the beginning. The killer had committed his crimes in one of the most densely populated areas of London, yet had somehow managed to remain anonymous. That anonymity was his greatest weapon, and one that the police were never able to penetrate. As the investigation gradually wound down, attention turned to the question of how many victims Jack the Ripper had actually claimed. The canonical five, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes and Mary Jane Kelly, were generally agreed upon as genuine Ripper murders based on the similarities in method and the timing of the deaths. But there were other murders in and around Whitechapel during the same period that might have been the work of the same killer. Martha Tabram, found stabbed to death in George Yard Buildings on the 7th of August, showed a different method than the later murders, but had died shortly before the Ripper series began. Emma Smith, attacked and killed in April 1888, had been the victim of a gang assault rather than a single killer. Rose Milett, found strangled in December 1888. Alice Mackenzie, killed in July 1889 with her throat cut and minor abdominal mutilations. And Frances Coles, murdered in February 1891 with her throat cut but no mutilations, might or might not have been Ripper victims depending on how one interpreted the evidence. The debate over the number of victims reflected a deeper uncertainty about the nature of the Ripper crimes. Were they the work of a single killer operating according to a consistent pattern, or were some of them copycat murders committed by different men who were inspired by or seeking to take advantage of the panic surrounding the original series? Was there a clear beginning and end to the murder spree, or did it gradually escalate and then gradually wind down? Did the killer stop because he died, or was arrested for other crimes, or fled the country, or simply lost interest in killing? These questions could not be definitively answered based on the available evidence, and different investigators and commentators reached different conclusions based on how they weighed the various factors. What was certain was that the murders had fundamentally changed Whitechapel and the public perception of the East End. The intense press coverage had made the district synonymous with poverty, vice, and violence in the minds of middle-class Londoners who had never visited and never would visit. The murders had exposed the terrible conditions in which tens of thousands of people lived, the overcrowding and filth and desperation that characterised daily life in the slums. Reformers had seized upon the Ripper case as evidence that something needed to be done about the East End, that the existing system of leaving the poor to fend for themselves was not merely unjust, but dangerous to society as a whole. Various schemes for slum clearance and improved housing were proposed, though most would come to nothing in the face of economic realities and political indifference. The women who had walked the streets during the Autumn of Terror slowly resumed their lives as the immediate danger seemed to pass. They still needed money for lodging and food, still had no other means of earning it, still had to venture into the darkness despite their fear. The police patrols gradually returned to normal levels as resources were redirected to other matters. The vigilance committees disbanded, their members returning to their ordinary lives now that the crisis appeared to have ended. The lodging houses continued to fill each night with the desperate and destitute. The public houses continued to serve gin and beer to customers seeking oblivion. The slaughterhouses and factories and docks continued their work, grinding through human labour and spitting out the exhausted remnants. Whitechapel returned to being what it had always been, a place where the poor lived and died in conditions that the rest of London preferred to ignore. But something had changed in those 3 months of autumn. The 5 women whose names would be remembered, Polly Nichols, Dark Annie Chapman, Long Liz Stride, Kate Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, had been transformed from anonymous prostitutes into something approaching martyrs, their deaths forcing society to confront the reality of life in the slums. They had been mothers and daughters, wives and widows. They had worked and struggled and tried to survive in a world that offered them almost nothing. They had died horribly, their bodies mutilated in ways that shocked even hardened police officers and doctors. And in their dying they had become immortal, their names permanently linked to the greatest criminal mystery of the Victorian age. Jack the Ripper himself, whoever he had been, had achieved a different kind of immortality. His name would be invoked for generations whenever people spoke of serial killers or unsolved crimes. The mystery of his identity would spawn countless theories and investigations, books and articles, and eventually films and documentaries without number. He would become a figure of dark fascination, the ultimate Victorian villain, the embodiment of evil lurking beneath the veneer of civilization. The fact that he was never caught only enhanced his legendary status, allowing each generation to project its own fears and obsessions onto his shadow figure. He was the gentleman gone mad, the doctor-turned-monster, the immigrant bringing foreign violence to English shores, the product of urban decay and moral collapse. He was whatever people needed him to be to explain the inexplicable. The investigation officially remained open, though by 1892 the Metropolitan Police had largely moved on to other matters. The case files were preserved, the evidence catalogued and stored, the reports filed away for future reference. Occasionally a new suspect would emerge, or a fresh theory would be proposed and the files would be retrieved and examined once again. But no breakthrough ever came, no deathbed confession provided closure, no newly discovered evidence revealed the killer's identity. The mystery remained, and would remain, forever unsolved. As the 19th century drew toward its close and London moved into the 20th, Whitechapel changed slowly. Some slums were cleared and replaced with model dwellings, though the new housing served to displace the poor rather than improve their conditions. The district remained one of the poorest in London, a destination for successive waves of immigrants seeking refuge from persecution and poverty in their homelands. The streets where the Ripper had hunted were gradually rebuilt or renamed, the physical evidence of the murders erased by time and development, but the memory persisted, passed down through local folklore, commemorated in books and museums, preserved in the dark corners of London's historical consciousness. The 5 women who died were buried in paupers' graves, their funerals paid for by charity when their families could not or would not contribute. Their graves, where they could be located, became pilgrimage sites for those obsessed with the case, visited by amateur investigators and true crime enthusiasts who left flowers and tokens in memory of women they had never known. The graves themselves would gradually fade, the markers eroding or disappearing, the exact locations becoming uncertain. But the names remained, and the story remained, and the autumn of 1888 remained forever frozen in history as the time when Jack the Ripper walked the streets of Whitechapel and the world learned what a true terror looked like. The women who survived that autumn, who had walked those same streets and might easily have been victims themselves, carried on because they had no choice but to carry on. They continued to struggle for survival in a city that cared nothing for their welfare. Some eventually escaped prostitution, finding work or husbands or simply aging out of the trade. Others died in the years that followed, from disease or violence or simple exhaustion, their deaths unremarked and unmourned except by those who had known them in life. They were the forgotten ones, the women who did not become famous through their murders, who lived and died in obscurity as the poor always had. Their stories were never told, their names never recorded in the history books, their sufferings known only to themselves and to God. The fog came down thick over Whitechapel on the last night of 1888, as the year that had seen so much blood and terror drew to its close. The streets were quiet, the public houses filled with people seeking to drink away the memories of the autumn. At midnight, the bells rang out across London, marking the transition to 1889, and in Whitechapel the poor listened and wondered what the new year would bring. The killer, wherever he was, heard those bells as well. Perhaps he was in London still, anonymous among millions. Perhaps he was far away, having fled to some other city or country. Perhaps he was dead, his body already in the ground, his secrets buried with him. No one knew, no one would ever know. The mystery remained, perfect and complete, a locked room at the heart of history that would never be opened. The candle burned low in the lodging houses and the tenements. The fire in the grates turned to ash. And somewhere in the darkness of that winter night, perhaps in Whitechapel, or perhaps in some other shadowed corner of the city, a man closed his eyes and remembered the autumn and smiled. His work was done. His name was immortal. He had written his story in blood on the streets of London, and the world would never forget. Jack the Ripper had come and gone, leaving only questions behind, and 5 women dead in their graves, and a city that would never quite feel safe again. The silence that followed his last murder was deeper than any silence before it, a silence that would stretch across the decades and the centuries, broken only by endless speculation about a man who had killed and vanished and left nothing behind but his terrible legend. And in that silence, history closed the book and turned the page in the dark.